He walked into the bank dressed in power, in dignity, in success. But what unfolded wasn't business. It was betrayal. In a world of marble floors and chandeliers, a single man was reduced to suspicion, humiliation, and silence. This is not just a story about a check. It's a story about judgment, prejudice, and the moment truth turned the tables on those who thought they held all the power. The marble floors gleamed under the soft golden light, but beneath the polished surface of the Crownstone Bank in downtown Nashville, something sinister was waiting to unfold. The faint chime of the door announced his arrival, Darius. Tall, poised, dressed in a navy suit so sharp it whispered power, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who knew who he was. Yet in this place of prestige, appearances weren't just noticed. They were judged. The scent of leather and polished wood filled the air, mingling with the murmurs of business whispered between wealthy patrons. This was not an ordinary bank. It was a temple of privilege, its walls designed to remind outsiders that wealth was worshipped here, and that only those deemed worthy belonged. Darius held a check in his hand, the kind of check that could silence a room. But he wasn't here to boast. He was here to be treated with the same courtesy any other client would expect. He stepped into line, calm, patient, and unbothered by the slow shuffle forward. His eyes swept across the grand chandeliers that bathed the room in warmth, the upholstered chairs where clients lounged as if banking were a luxury sport. For Darius, it was all familiar, yet something in the air felt heavy, the kind of heaviness that came not from marble ceilings, but from invisible eyes waiting to measure him. When his turn finally came, he approached the counter with quiet authority. The teller, young, nervous, almost startled by the numbers inked on the paper, glanced at the check before her face turned carefully neutral. "I'll need to call my manager," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of unease she tried and failed to hide. Darius gave her a reassuring nod, a small smile that said, "Take your time." He had no reason to worry. Or so it seemed. Moments later, the manager appeared. Mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, his tailored suit cut to project authority. His name was Simmons. He didn't walk. He strode toward the counter, each step a performance meant to remind everyone who controlled this space. His eyes went first to the check and then to Darius. And in that single glance, the room shifted. There was hesitation in his stare, a flicker of suspicion too sharp to be protocol, too personal to be policy. His lips tightened as he spoke, his tone firm, almost accusatory. "Do you have any identification to go with this?" Darius moved calmly, sliding his license across the counter. Simmons barely looked at it before pushing it back, his eyes narrowing as though the simple act of existing in that suit, in this bank, with that check, was a crime. What should have been routine had already become something else. The walls of Crownstone, built to display power, had just become the stage for humiliation. And though Darius stood tall, calm, and unshaken, the storm was only beginning to gather. Simmons held the check delicately, not like a routine document, but like a piece of evidence in a crime he already believed had been committed. He studied it as though its numbers were impossible, as though they had no business being in the hands of a man like Darius. There was a pause. A silence so sharp it cut through the hum of conversation in the grand hall. Customers shifted in their seats, some pretending not to look while their eyes flickered back again and again. They knew something was happening. They could feel it. "Just give me a moment," Simmons muttered, his tone flat, dismissive. Without another word, he turned his back and walked briskly toward his office. Darius remained at the counter, still. His posture was upright, his expression unreadable, but within his chest, his heartbeat carried the weight of generations. He had felt this before, that quiet cutting doubt, the look that wasn't about facts, but about skin. Minutes ticked by. The teller avoided his gaze, her hands fidgeting nervously with papers that didn't need sorting. Whispers drifted through the air, customers leaning in toward one another, their eyes darting toward him and then away again. The judgment was unspoken, but it filled the room as surely as the scent of polished wood. Finally, Simmons reappeared. He moved slowly now, a calculated performance. Holding the check in one hand, he looked at Darius, his voice loud enough to ensure others nearby could hear. "This check raises some red flags. Can you tell me where you got it?" The words hung heavy, not as a question but as an accusation. Darius's head tilted slightly, his dark eyes unblinking, steady. "It was issued to me as payment for a business transaction," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Everything is in order." Simmons let out a dry chuckle. Not the laugh of amusement, but of condescension. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice though everyone could still hear. "A business transaction, huh? And what business are you in exactly?" For a moment, the vast marble chamber felt smaller, the air tighter. The spotlight wasn't on the check anymore. It was on Darius. His tone, his confidence, his very existence being questioned. "I'm in real estate development," Darius replied evenly, refusing to break eye contact. Simmons smirked. "Real estate? Must be quite a deal to hand you a check like this." He waved it lightly, like a trophy no one believed Darius deserved. And then, without a pause, the words fell like a hammer. "I'm going to have to decline this transaction." The sentence echoed across the room, louder than it was spoken. Heads turned. A woman near the entrance looked up sharply, her eyes flicking from Simmons to Darius. A teller whispered to her coworker, their gazes tinged with unease. Darius's voice cut through the growing murmur, calm yet edged with steel. "You haven't verified anything yet. The issuing party's contact information is right there. Call them!" But Simmons waved him off with a dismissive flick of his hand. "I don't need to waste my time chasing down details for something that's obviously suspicious. If you want, try cashing it somewhere else." The volume of his voice rose just enough for the entire lobby to hear. It wasn't just a refusal. It was a public display, a branding. The air thickened. In that moment, it was no longer about a piece of paper. It was about dignity, and Simmons had just tried to strip it away. The room grew louder with murmurs, but the real noise was in the silence between the words, the way people watched but said nothing. Darius stood tall, his composure still intact, though his calm had shifted into something sharper. The sting of humiliation wasn't new to him, but that didn't make it any less heavy. He stepped closer to the counter, his voice steady, his words cutting through the air like glass. "So you're refusing to validate this check. Because why exactly?" Simmons leaned back slightly, his smirk returning like armor. "Look," he said with feigned patience, "these procedures are in place for a reason. It's not personal." But his eyes told a different story. They lingered on Darius not with caution, but with disdain. This wasn't protocol. This was prejudice dressed in a suit. Darius's stare didn't break. "If it's not personal," he said firmly, "then follow standard protocol. Verify the check. Make a call. Do your job. Or are you suggesting that I don't belong here?" The question struck like a thunderclap. For a moment, Simmons faltered, his smirk slipping, his confidence cracking. But then he recovered quickly, hiding behind a sneer. "Sir," he said, drawing out the word as though it were beneath him, "this bank reserves the right to refuse service if something seems off. And frankly, this doesn't look right to me." The sentence landed like a public sentence. Heads turned again, customers now openly watching. A woman by the velvet ropes looked away quickly, uncomfortable. A man seated near the door frowned but stayed silent. The crowd was there, but no one intervened. Darius let out a small, deliberate breath. "Interesting," he said, his voice low, calm, but dangerous in its control. He adjusted his jacket, every movement precise. Like a man preparing for a battle he'd fought too many times before. "So instead of facts, you've chosen feelings," he said, his words sharp enough to slice the thick silence. The manager stiffened. His jaw tightened and his pride wouldn't let him step back. He raised his voice, performing now, his words aimed at the entire room. "Sir, I don't need to explain myself further. You can take this up with another branch if you like, but here, you're wasting your time." The tension thickened, suffocating. Darius's composure cracked just slightly, not in defeat, but in defiance. He leaned in close enough that Simmons felt the weight of every word. "Oh, I'll escalate it, Mr. Simmons, and trust me, you're going to regret this." For the first time, the manager's smug armor wavered. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, though his lips tried to twist into another smirk. "Is that a threat?" he asked, though the question trembled where confidence should have been. Darius didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he pulled out his phone. His movements were deliberate, calm, purposeful, the kind of calm that carries more power than rage ever could. Simmons scoffed, muttering under his breath, loud enough for the room to hear. Some people really don't know when to quit. A few customers chuckled nervously, others shifting in their seats. The whispers grew, filling the marble chamber with the heavy breath of judgment. But Darius didn't flinch. He stood there, a pillar of resolve in the storm of condescension. And though Simmons thought he had humiliated him, something unseen was already shifting. The stage had been set, and justice was walking in. The silence inside the bank was broken by the sound of heavy footsteps. They weren't rushed, but deliberate, the kind of stride that carries power with it. Every head in the lobby turned toward the entrance as the doors swung open. A tall woman stepped inside, her sharp blazer cutting through the atmosphere like a blade. Behind her followed two executives, their tailored suits crisp, their expressions cold and unyielding. They didn't come as customers. They came as authority. Simmons froze at the counter, his smug mask faltering for the first time. He had been the loudest voice in the room, but suddenly his stage felt smaller. Much smaller. The woman's eyes swept the bank with quiet command before landing on Darius. And in that instant, the balance of power shifted. "Mr. Charles," she said warmly, her tone filled with respect that carried across the marble floor. "I came as soon as I got your call." Gasps rippled through the lobby. Murmurs rose like a wave, crashing against the silence that followed. Customers looked at each other in disbelief. Even the tellers leaned forward, their hands covering their mouths. Simmons's face paled. His polished confidence collapsed under the weight of recognition. The man he had just dismissed, mocked, and humiliated was no ordinary customer. The woman strode across the floor, her heels striking with authority, each click echoing like judgment. She stopped at Darius's side, shaking his hand firmly before turning to Simmons, her gaze sharp enough to pin him in place. "I assume you're Mr. Simmons," she said coldly. He swallowed hard. "Yes, that's me. May I ask what this is about?" His attempt at control fell flat, his words tripping over themselves. She lifted the check between two fingers, holding it as though it were now a piece of evidence. Not against Darius, but against Simmons. "This," she said icily, "is a matter of grave concern. Mr. Charles here is not just a client. He is one of our most valued partners." The color drained from Simmons's face. "Valued partner?" he repeated weakly, as if the words themselves betrayed him. Her eyes narrowed. "Not just a partner. Mr. Charles is the majority shareholder of this institution." The words slammed into the room like a gavel striking wood. Gasps spread through the lobby. A man near the window dropped the magazine from his hands. A teller stifled a gasp, covering her mouth in disbelief. And Simmons? His authority evaporated in an instant. The man who had paraded himself as judge and gatekeeper now stood exposed. Trembling, humiliated, cornered. Darius did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stood silently, his calm presence louder than any shout could ever be. The truth had arrived, and it was crushing. The air inside the bank grew suffocating. Silence stretched across the marble floor, broken only by the faint hum of the chandeliers above. Every pair of eyes was locked on Simmons, who stood trembling in a suit that no longer commanded respect. His power had been stripped bare. Darius, calm as ever, finally spoke, his voice steady, sharp, impossible to ignore. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to find out. From the moment I walked through those doors, you judged me. Not on facts, not on protocol, but on sight." His words cut through the silence like a blade. A low murmur swept through the crowd. shame, guilt, and realization blending in the uneasy air. A young woman near the door lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably, the truth hitting harder than Simmons's arrogance ever had. The female executive's voice followed, colder than steel. She turned her full attention to Simmons, her words dripping with condemnation. Your behavior today was not only unprofessional, it was unacceptable. Our institution claims to stand for integrity, fairness, and equality. What you've displayed here spits on those values. Simmons's mouth opened and closed, but no defense came. Sweat glistened on his forehead, his lips trembling. The man who moments ago had laughed in arrogance now looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Darius didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He stepped closer to the counter, his presence commanding without theatrics. This isn't about embarrassment, he said, his eyes fixed on Simmons. It's about exposure. You showed everyone here today exactly who you are. You made it clear that bias, not policy, guides your decisions. The words echoed across the lobby, heavy with truth. Customers shifted in their seats, their faces a mixture of shame and recognition. A man near the velvet ropes nodded faintly, almost an apology. While others avoided eye contact altogether, Simmons stammered, I can explain, but the executive woman silenced him with a sharp glance. Save it. Your actions spoke louder than words ever could. You failed to do the most basic due diligence. Instead of verifying facts, you leapt to assumptions. Dangerous ones. Ones that could have cost this institution more than just a client. Gasps rippled again. Even the tellers looked shaken, one of them clutching her hands together nervously as if praying to disappear. Darius turned, not just to Simmons, but to the entire room. His voice rose, not in anger, but in the weight of undeniable truth. I want to make something clear. This isn't just about me. This is about how people are treated when prejudice outweighs professionalism. I came here today expecting fairness. Instead, I was judged, dismissed, and humiliated in front of all of you. And you watched it happen. The words fell heavy. The bank had become a courtroom, and every witness was guilty of silence. The lobby of the bank had become a theater of silence. The customers, once whispering and sneering, now sat frozen, their shame visible in their downcast eyes. Even the tellers behind the counters stood stiff, their hands trembling at the weight of what they had just witnessed. The female executive stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of the entire institution. Mr. Charles, she said respectfully, turning briefly to Darius, I want to assure you that this does not represent who we are as a bank. What happened here today was a failure, of judgment, of professionalism, of humanity. Her gaze snapped back to Simmons, sharp as a knife. And Mr. Simmons, your behavior is not a mistake we can simply overlook. You didn't just deny service. You projected your bias onto an entire room. You humiliated a man you should have treated with respect, and you risked the reputation of this institution in the process. The words landed like hammer blows. Simmons's face was slick with sweat, his jaw trembling. He tried to form an excuse, a lifeline, but nothing came. He had no defense. His silence was louder than any words could be. Darius stepped forward, his calm composure steady, his voice deliberate. This was never about a check. This was about something much deeper. About the way people are seen or not seen. About the instant judgments that shape how we are treated. You didn't ask questions. You didn't verify. You assumed, and assumptions like yours, he paused, letting the silence weigh heavy on the room, are the roots of prejudice. The audience in the bank shifted uncomfortably. A man near the window shook his head in quiet shame. A young teller bit her lip, her eyes glistening, her conscience pricked by the truth unfolding before her. The executive woman folded her arms, her voice like ice. This kind of bias will not be tolerated in this institution. Training, oversight, accountability, all of it will be implemented without delay. But make no mistake, Simmons, what you've done here today has consequences, and they begin now. Simmons looked like a man on trial, his arrogance stripped bare, his pride shattered. He opened his mouth, but Darius raised a hand, silencing him. There's nothing you can say, Darius told him, his voice calm but heavy. Your actions spoke louder than anything that could come out of your mouth, and every single person in this room heard them. The room was silent again. Customers avoided Simmons's gaze, tellers lowered their eyes, and even the chandeliers above seemed dimmer, as though the very building felt the weight of his disgrace. The silence inside the bank wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. The polished marble, the golden chandeliers, the velvet ropes, all of it now felt like props on a stage where prejudice had just been exposed. And standing at the center of it all was Darius, no longer just a client, but a voice. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room, past the tellers shifting uneasily, past the customers pretending not to look. His voice, calm but unyielding, filled the air. I want every single one of you to understand something. This is bigger than me. What happened here is not about a check, or even about a single man. It's about what happens when assumptions replace facts, when bias becomes more important than truth. His words carried a weight that pressed on every soul in the room. A woman near the entrance nodded faintly, her eyes glassy with realization. A man in a tailored jacket shifted uncomfortably, his face red with shame. Even those who had laughed at Simmons's smug comments moments ago now sat silent, their guilt laid bare. I walked in here, Darius continued, expecting to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. Not more, not less. Just fairly. Instead, I was dismissed, judged, humiliated, and it didn't happen in secret. It happened in front of all of you. And you stayed silent. The last words cut deeper than any accusation. A teller glanced down at her shaking hands. A customer bowed his head. The truth wasn't just about Simmons anymore. It was about everyone in that room who had let the injustice breathe. The executive woman stood behind Darius, her expression stern, but even she seemed struck by the depth of his words. This wasn't a speech. This was a reckoning. Bias, Darius said softly, his tone sharpening like the edge of a blade. Whether conscious or unconscious, destroys trust. It poisons dignity, and it makes people question whether they belong in places they have every right to stand. The words echoed across the marble walls, bouncing back like a haunting reminder. You could feel it in the stillness, the shift, the unease, the realization that the room had just become a mirror, reflecting everyone's silence, everyone's complicity. Darius didn't shout. He didn't rage. He didn't need to. His calm, deliberate voice carried more force than thunder. And with each word, Simmons seemed to shrink further, his once confident posture collapsing under the crushing truth that he had been unmasked. The bank was no longer just a financial institution. It had become a courtroom, and the verdict was clear. The lobby felt frozen, as if the very air had thickened under the weight of truth. Every person in that room, customers, tellers, even passers-by who had stopped to peek inside, was being forced to confront the ugliness of what had just unfolded. The female executive stepped forward again, her voice sharp, carrying the weight of an institution now forced to reckon with itself. "Mr. Charles," she said, her tone respectful but heavy with regret, "we deeply apologize for what you endured. This does not reflect the values we claim to uphold. And let me make this clear. Action will be taken. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Now!" Her eyes darted to Simmons, pinning him in place. The trembling in his hands betrayed his fear. "Mr. Simmons," she continued coldly, "your conduct today was a violation of our code of ethics, our standards, and basic human decency. You didn't just fail to follow protocol. You weaponized your bias. And in doing so, you jeopardized not only this branch, but the reputation of the entire institution." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A teller covered her mouth, shaken. A man by the window muttered softly, "Unbelievable," though his voice carried more shame than surprise. Simmons's lips quivered as he tried to muster a defense. I was just being careful. I didn't—" "Careful?" Darius's voice cut through him like a blade. He stepped forward, every word deliberate. Careful would have been following the rules. Careful would have been verifying the check before making assumptions. What you did wasn't careful. It was careless, reckless, and it exposed exactly what you think when you look at someone like me. The lobby fell silent again, the truth reverberating like thunder. The executive woman's voice followed, colder than before. "Save your excuses, Mr. Simmons. What you did here is indefensible. You've humiliated not just a client, but our majority shareholder. And you did it in front of an entire room of witnesses. This is no small mistake. This is systemic. And it ends today." Simmons' face drained of color. His body swayed slightly, as though the weight of his downfall might physically pull him to the ground. The smug arrogance he had carried only minutes ago was gone, replaced by the raw, ugly truth of a man exposed. The audience in the bank, customers who had once been spectators, now sat in stunned silence. They had witnessed a performance of power, arrogance, and prejudice, only to watch it crumble in real time. And Darius, he stood still, dignified, a man who didn't need to shout. His silence was more powerful than Simmons's protests could ever be. Darius let the silence linger, heavy and suffocating. Simmons stood trembling, his once polished authority crumbling into dust, while the rest of the lobby held its breath. The entire bank had become a witness, and now, it was time for them to hear the truth that could no longer be ignored. Darius stepped forward, his voice calm but resonant, carrying through the marble chamber with the weight of centuries. "Respect," he said slowly, his eyes locked on Simmons, "isn't something you hand out as a favor. It's not a courtesy you extend only to the people who look the way you expect them to. Respect is the minimum. It's the baseline. It's what every human being deserves the moment they walk through these doors, whether they're cashing $10 or $10 million. The words struck the crowd like a wave. Heads bowed, faces flushed. Even the chandeliers above seemed dimmer, as if the building itself knew it was being judged. "You didn't fail because of policy," Darius continued, his voice unshakable. "You failed because of prejudice. You looked at me and decided I didn't belong. You didn't call to verify the facts. You didn't ask questions. You didn't even try. Instead, you made assumptions. And assumptions like yours," he paused, his gaze sweeping the room, "are the foundation of prejudice. They are the seeds of racism. They grow into walls that keep people out, walls that should never have existed in the first place." A hush fell deeper over the crowd. The young teller who had first assisted him blinked back tears, her trembling hands pressed against the counter. A customer in the corner shifted uncomfortably, his earlier silence now branded on his conscience. Darius's tone softened, but the weight behind it only grew stronger. "I didn't call your superiors here to embarrass you, Mr. Simmons. If that was my goal, I could have destroyed you in front of everyone. But that's not who I am. I called them because I wanted everyone in this room to see exactly what prejudice looks like when it hides behind professionalism. I wanted every person here to feel the weight of silence, the silence that allows moments like this to happen every single day." His gaze swept across the lobby. Some customers met his eyes with shame, others with quiet nods of agreement. No one dared to speak. "This isn't about one man and a check," Darius finished, his voice deep with finality. "It's about accountability. It's about whether we choose to stay blind or whether we choose to do better. Because change doesn't begin with policies on paper. Change begins with people choosing, every single day, to treat each other with dignity." The words echoed through the bank like a verdict. Simmons looked down, his hands trembling around the check he had once held like a weapon. His arrogance was gone, replaced by silence. The silence of a man unmasked. The bank lobby felt like a church after a sermon, heavy, quiet, every soul reflecting on what had just been laid bare. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. The weight of Darius's words clung to the air like smoke after a fire. The executive woman stepped forward once more, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a gavel striking wood. She faced the customers and the staff, her voice firm, unshaken. "Let this be a lesson for all of us. This institution was built on trust, on fairness, on equality. When we allow bias to poison that foundation, we fail, not just as professionals, but as human beings. Some customers nodded, visibly moved. Others looked down in shame, their silence now a confession. Behind the counter, the young teller who had first dealt with Darius discreetly wiped her eyes, his words still echoing in her chest. Darius turned, scanning the room one final time. His gaze was not angry, but resolute, the kind of look that seared itself into memory. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small business card. He handed it gently to the young teller, her hands trembling as she accepted it. "If you ever feel you're being treated unfairly," he said softly, his voice carrying more power in its calm than any shout could, "call me. Because we all deserve better than what we saw today." Her lips quivered as she whispered, "Thank you." Darius adjusted his suit jacket, his dignity untouched, his silence now a force louder than Simmons's earlier arrogance. He turned toward the doors, each step echoing through the lobby like a drumbeat of justice. Simmons stood frozen behind the counter, pale and hollow, clutching the check with trembling fingers. His eyes followed Darius, but he could not meet his gaze. He was no longer the manager of a prestigious branch. He was a man exposed. The great glass doors opened, and Darius stepped out onto the bustling Nashville sidewalk. The hum of the city carried on as if nothing had happened, but for those inside the bank, nothing would ever feel the same. Outside, Darius paused, glancing up at the towering building. A faint, almost tired smile touched his lips. His phone buzzed, a message from the executive woman. "All actions have been set in motion. Thank you for giving us the chance to make this right." He typed back simply, "Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step matters." Sliding his phone back into his pocket, he exhaled deeply. The confrontation had been draining but necessary. For too long, injustices like this had gone unchecked, hidden beneath polished wood and corporate smiles. But today, the veil had been torn away for everyone to see. As he disappeared into the flow of the city, his words still lingered in the marble halls behind him. "Respect isn't a privilege. It's a right." Inside the bank, no one spoke. Customers sat in silence. The tellers shuffled papers nervously. And Simmons stared down at the check in his hand, his face pale, his pride shattered. It was over. But for everyone in that room, the memory of what they had witnessed would not fade. The silence in the lobby was not empty. It was full. Full of shame, full of guilt, full of change waiting to happen. And the lesson Darius left behind? It would echo long after his footsteps had vanished from the marble floor. Stories like this are not just tales of arrogance and humiliation. They are mirrors, forcing us to see the bias that lingers in silence. Respect is not a privilege. It is a right. If this story moved you, don't let it fade into the noise. Share it, speak it, and stand with us against prejudice. Like this video, subscribe to Blacks Chronicles, and join us in uncovering the hidden truths they'd rather keep buried.